Today, I am announcing that the Government of Canada, following a dollar-for-dollar approach, additional $29.8 billion of imports from the United States.
We read in Politico that Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to shut off his province's electricity exports to the United States.
A sudden shutdown. Billions worth of products returned. 6 provinces united. And only one question echoes now. Can Washington survive this hit? Because Canada's biggest provinces have boycotted U.S. imports. And believe me, they gave no warning, no drawn-out diplomacy. The U.S. slapped tariffs on their goods in front of the whole world. But they didn't even flinch to feed Washington's ego. They just turned the trucks around, left cargo stranded, and froze billions in U.S. goods at crossings. And if you think this was just over a few trade disputes, you're missing the real cracks in America's foundation. You might be asking, what pushed them this far, and how deep does this fracture run? 6 Canadian provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, British Columbia, Quebec, and New Brunswick, stood shoulder to shoulder and dropped a hammer that echoed across the border. They were suspending all non-essential U.S. imports. No delay, no soft warnings. One announcement, one coordinated action, and within hours, the gate slammed shut on America's northern trade lifeline. This wasn't just a protest, it was a direct economic strike, the kind of move that can rewrite alliances and cripple supply chains. And what followed wasn't damage control, it was a full-scale unraveling. For months, the tension had been boiling just beneath the surface. Backdoor disputes, slow-burning resentment, quiet meetings where provincial leaders began comparing notes, all realizing they were being bled dry by a neighbor they once trusted. Washington's escalating tariffs, designed to choke Canadian exports, had pushed these provinces to the brink. But no one in DC imagined the provinces would unite, bypass Ottawa's federal line, and unleash an economic rebellion that would blindside the White House. And yet, that's exactly what they did. This wasn't about diplomacy, it was about defiance. A message carved in steel and sealed with silence. But the fallout didn't stay on paper. It hit the ports with surgical force. At the Port of Vancouver, cranes froze mid-lift. In Montreal, entire shipping yards fell silent. U.S. trucks loaded with everything from produce to industrial machinery were turned around at land crossings, escorted by armed customs officers with zero flexibility. Within 24 hours, choke points formed at major trade arteries, and border queues stretched for miles. Drivers were left stranded with no clear instruction. Businesses received cancellation notices instead of shipments, and the logistical arteries that feed U.S. commerce began to seize. This wasn't a slowdown, it was a blockade, executed with precision that only comes from months of secret planning. And while the roads jammed, the numbers started slicing into the American economy. Initial damage assessments are brutal. Over $38 billion worth of US goods are now stranded, either locked in warehouses, stuck in transport limbo, or rerouted through overpriced foreign intermediaries. Entire sectors went dark overnight. Food suppliers in New York, steel firms in Ohio, machinery importers in Michigan, all caught flat-footed as the northern flow snapped. And as provincial premiers doubled down, Washington realized this was no temporary scuffle. This was a coordinated retaliation, and America had walked straight into it, blinded by arrogance and drunk on tariff power. But the worst part isn't what's stuck at the border. It's what this disruption reveals about who really holds the leverage now. This entire crisis didn't materialize out of thin air. It was built, brick by brick, in Washington. In May 2025, the U.S. Trade Representative made a move that would go down as one of the most self-sabotaging trade decisions in modern history, hiking tariffs on Canadian lumber, dairy, and automotive parts under the banner of protecting American workers. On paper, it sounded patriotic. In practice, it was reckless economic provocation. Ottawa raised its voice. Provincial leaders warned of consequences. But Washington didn't blink. They thought they could squeeze Canada like a side player in their global chess game. Instead, they poked 6 sleeping giants into action. And when the pressure started rising in the West, it wasn't DC that felt the heat, it was Canadian families. The tariffs didn't just disrupt Canadian exports, they detonated domestic markets. Lumber prices skyrocketed, dairy shelves thinned out, car parts became luxury items overnight. Provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, heavily reliant on cross-border trade, took the brunt of the blow. The average Canadian saw prices on essential goods jump by 17% in just 6 weeks. Construction projects stalled, factories slowed production, and middle-class households were forced to cut back on groceries just to pay for gas and rent. It wasn't inflation, it was economic strangulation. And behind the polite language of press conferences, a storm of provincial fury was brewing. But while Canada reached for the diplomatic playbook, the White House doubled down with both hands. In early June, Canada's Foreign Affairs Office attempted formal diplomatic outreach. Letters were sent, calls were made. Ottawa tried every traditional route to de-escalate the looming trade war. The response from Washington, silence, followed by even more aggressive tariff enforcement. Sources close to the situation revealed that the Biden administration believed Canada had too much to lose to retaliate. That assumption wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophically miscalculated. By the time Washington realized the provinces weren't bluffing, the alliance had already splintered behind closed doors. Quebec and Alberta began leading covert coordination talks, setting the stage for an unprecedented economic rebellion. And the Carney government? Powerless, paralyzed, completely outflanked. When Alberta and Quebec demanded economic countermeasures, Ottawa hesitated. Carney's team feared further escalation with the U.S. and clung to the belief that federal diplomacy could contain the fallout. But the provinces were done waiting. What Washington didn't understand, and what Carney failed to control, was that provincial premiers had the constitutional latitude and economic leverage to strike on their own terms. One by one, they began to act independently. Provincial legislatures passed emergency resolutions. Trade liaisons were cut off. Port authorities were given instructions. Carney watched his authority erode in real time and did nothing, because the truth was, he never saw the fire spreading until it had already reached the foundation. Then came the leak, the internal Biden administration memo that exposed just how deep Washington's miscalculation ran. Dated June 5th, the document outlined an internal risk assessment where economic advisors concluded Canada's provinces were unlikely to bypass federal restraint due to legal and structural limitations. That memo was supposed to stay hidden, locked away in the bureaucracy. Instead, it landed in the inboxes of multiple Canadian journalists and officials. Within hours, it became headline news across Canada, and an immediate call to arms for every province that had been sidelined, underestimated, and economically throttled. And once that leak went public, restraint turned into retaliation, and the gloves came off. Alberta didn't just join the revolt, it lit the match and threw it straight at America's energy backbone. As soon as the joint import suspension was declared, Alberta moved with ruthless precision. It shut off U.S. orders for crude oil, refined gasoline, and liquefied natural gas without blinking. No negotiation, no phasing out, just a cold, calculated blockade of fuel exports to the very regions that rely on Alberta's lifeline. For decades, the U.S. had leaned on Alberta's vast oil sands like a crutch, quietly taking billions in energy while leaving threats and tariffs like cheap currency. But on June 17th, that crutch snapped in half, and Washington didn't have a backup. And in less than 48 hours, American fuel infrastructure began to collapse like a house of cards. Northern U.S. refineries, especially those in North Dakota, Montana, and Michigan, were the first to feel the burn. These facilities had built their entire supply chains around Alberta's export pipelines, expecting a steady flow that never dried up. Until now, within a day of Alberta's embargo, production lines stalled, refining capacity dropped, fuel deliveries were canceled, truck stops issued ration alerts, and regional gas stations began jacking up prices as panic kicked in. Some facilities tried switching to domestic sources, but U.S. shale producers couldn't scale fast enough to patch the hole Alberta just blew wide open. And while fuel vanished from pumps, Alberta's message thundered louder than oil rigs ever could. Premier Danielle Smith didn't tiptoe around the move. She stomped through the global stage with unapologetic force, calling the embargo an energy embargo against economic sabotage. She framed Alberta's action not as rebellion, but as justice. She wasn't defending a province, she was defending economic sovereignty. Smith made it clear, if Washington wanted to weaponize trade, Alberta would weaponize oil. This wasn't just about tariffs anymore, it was about who controls the switch. And Alberta just proved they were done being treated like a fuel faucet the US could twist on and off at will. And as Alberta tightened its grip, the American public began paying the price. Literally. With 22% of US imported Canadian fuel gone overnight, gas prices didn't rise gradually, they detonated. In the Midwest, fuel jumped by 41 cents per gallon in 2 days, the steepest increase since the 2022 energy panic. Local economies were blindsided, delivery fleets faced crippling new costs, grocery chains with razor-thin margins began slashing routes. Municipal bus systems in mid-sized cities like Grand Rapids and Bismarck announced emergency service cuts. This wasn't inflation, it was fuel warfare. Alberta didn't just remove a resource, they shattered a dependency that Washington never thought could be touched. And while prices surged, the clock began ticking on refinery survival. Desperation kicked in at the highest levels of Washington. Within hours, the Department of Energy scrambled to secure emergency fuel from overseas markets. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and even Brazil were rerouted to try and plug the supply vacuum Alberta had just created. But there was a problem. American infrastructure was never built to handle rapid rerouting from oceanic ports to interior refineries. Bottlenecks formed at Gulf Coast terminals. Rail systems couldn't scale. Storage capacity was maxed out in the east while the Midwest ran dry. Washington had underestimated just how deeply Alberta's veins ran into America's industrial heart, and now the system was breaking down under its own misplaced confidence. But what came next wasn't just logistical, it was existential. Alberta had changed the rules of the game. While Alberta weaponized energy, Quebec chose a more surgical but equally devastating strike. It didn't touch oil or steel or car parts. Instead, Quebec froze all U.S. pharmaceutical and medical imports across its customs zones. No pills, no syringes, no medical grade shipments of any kind were allowed to cross into or through Quebec's borders. What looked like a regional blockade was, in truth, a masterstroke of precision. Because while Alberta starved the economy, Quebec choked the lifeline of healthcare, and they knew exactly where to aim: New England. And it wasn't theory or forecast, the damage hit real patients in real time. Across Vermont, New Hampshire, and especially Maine, hospitals and nursing homes began reporting sudden stock shortages within 36 hours. These states had built their entire pharmaceutical import infrastructure around Quebec's low-cost distribution hubs. In a world obsessed with speed and efficiency, that dependence had gone unnoticed, until Quebec shut the tap. Over 4.3 million prescriptions, yes, million, were suddenly in limbo. Pharmacy shelves emptied of insulin, cardiac units postponed surgeries, elderly care facilities scrambled to ration antibiotics, even turning away non-critical patients. What Quebec unleashed wasn't just policy, it was panic medicine. And just like that, a silent system collapsed, and the silence was deafening. The Quebec government didn't mince words in their statement. They called out the elephant in the room: we will no longer accept exploitative supply chains dictated by DC lobbyists. This wasn't a backroom protest, it was a declaration of economic sovereignty painted in clinical terms. Quebec framed the blockade not as retaliation, but as liberation from a structure where life-saving medications were being routed and priced through systems that served corporations more than patients. And whether you agreed or not, the results were undeniable. America's healthcare system just lost one of its key arteries. And in that vacuum, Washington's response was too little, too late. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a formal declaration of public health emergency in Vermont and Maine. Emergency reserves were tapped. Military medical stocks were dispatched by air. But even that wasn't enough. The issue wasn't supply, it was access. With Quebec's customs sealed, shipments meant for dozens of public and private health facilities were either turned back or held in limbo at border depots. Frustrated hospital administrators warned of compounding delays in chemotherapy drugs and dialysis materials. Some clinics even resorted to cross-state crowdsourcing between pharmacies to stay operational. And while America scrambled for bandages, Quebec stood calm, watching it all unfold. British Columbia and Manitoba didn't just follow the lead, they escalated the entire conflict into new, dangerous territory. On June 18th, British Columbia made a swift and brutal decision to block all incoming shipments of U.S. software hardware, semiconductors, and surveillance equipment. It was an open rejection of American tech influence, framed under the banner of cyber sovereignty. But make no mistake, this was economic warfare wrapped in digital language. At the same time, Manitoba took aim at an entirely different sector and shut down all grain and meat imports from the United States, branding the system as food security manipulation. Together, these two provinces struck at the heart of America's tech innovation and agricultural dominance. This wasn't about symbolism, it was about crippling pillars of U.S. economic reach, and the shockwaves from that coordinated strike went far beyond the Canadian border. By the end of the day, US tech giants with operations rooted in the Pacific Northwest, Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, and even defense contractors began reporting internal chaos. Supply chains collapsed, orders were frozen, contracts with BC-based warehousing and assembly hubs became worthless overnight. Tech hardware meant for Canadian schools, government agencies, and private labs never arrived. Simultaneously, Manitoba's agricultural embargo sent shock through the Midwest. American ranchers expecting multi-million-dollar beef contracts were suddenly staring at cancellation notices. Over $5.2 billion in contracts vanished in less than 24 hours, evaporating like mist under a blowtorch. But what Manitoba claimed in their justification stunned even Washington insiders. In an unflinching press release, Manitoba's Agriculture Ministry alleged that 80% of US beef imports had failed updated Canadian inspections for pesticide and antibiotic residue. Whether political theater or genuine health concern, it provided an airtight shield for the embargo and a deeply embarrassing headline for the US meat industry. News outlets across Canada ran with it. Even in cities like Toronto and Calgary, panic buying began. Grocers started rationing meat. Health-conscious consumers flooded organic co-ops. But while Canadians stocked up out of fear, American suppliers watched their exports rot in holding yards. And while shelves emptied in panic, warehouses filled with unsellable goods in the US heartland. The embargo wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a logistical disaster. Perishable shipments stalled, entire freight lines went dark, rail systems from Nebraska to Manitoba sat idle. At least 3 major US food conglomerates halted international production due to uncertainty in the Canadian regulatory environment. The panic on Canadian streets was real, but the silent implosion in US agribusiness was bigger, and all of it was set into motion not with bombs or sanctions, but with border control and bold provincial resolve. But the damage didn't end with individual provinces. What followed was a national-scale breakdown, with 6 provinces effectively sealing their gates. America's export system didn't just slow, it shattered. US export hubs in Seattle, Buffalo, and Detroit saw backups that hadn't occurred since the early pandemic. Thousands of containers full of wheat, aircraft parts, tech products, and medical equipment sat stranded, unprocessed, and unacknowledged. Dock workers, many already working reduced hours, reported 0 outbound Canadian shipments for 72 hours straight. The ports weren't just clogged, they were frozen, and with every hour that passed, the backlog deepened. But the real carnage was unfolding far from the ports, in the farmland that fuels the American engine. Farmers in Iowa, Ohio, and Indiana began receiving gut punch updates. Export contracts canceled, delivery routes voided, payments suspended. What began as a policy scuffle now translated into a projected $9.3 billion in lost sales. Thousands of tons of grain, soy, and corn meant for Canadian feedlots or manufacturers were left to spoil. Some farmers attempted to pivot to domestic buyers, but supply overflow drowned the market. Prices plummeted, storage silos overflowed. Entire family-owned operations stared down bankruptcy in a matter of weeks. And when Washington finally tried to reroute the wreckage, they hit a wall of bureaucracy and treaties. Scrambling for alternatives, US trade negotiators tried to pivot exports through Mexico and Europe, but fast-track deals weren't possible. Existing trade agreements tied their hands. Certification processes, import quotas, legal limitations. Every alternative had red tape so thick it may as well have been barbed wire. The US wasn't just outmaneuvered, they were boxed in by their own rules. And the pressure began to rip through another layer of American logistics. Because beneath all the policy fallout, a human crisis was brewing, one that no treaty could fix. Trucking unions on both sides of the border reported mass layoffs. Cross-border drivers, already reeling from inflation and rising fuel costs, now found themselves without routes. American companies canceled contracts. Canadian firms froze shipments. Thousands of truckers, many of them small fleet operators or freelancers, lost their livelihoods in under a week. The engines stopped, the warehouses filled, and Washington, once confident it could strong-arm its northern neighbor, stood paralyzed in a mess of its own making. But what comes next won't just test economies, it will test governments, alliances, and the very meaning of North American unity, and that is yet to be seen.